Aside from our visitors this morning, most of you are aware of the fact that both Deb and I follow the lectionary, which is a 3-year cycle of readings from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the epistles, from the Gospels, and a psalm. And we choose 2 of those readings each week, usually one from the Hebrew Scriptures and one from the Gospel, and that's the text for the day. Often what preaching from the lectionary means is you come across stuff you would never choose under your own steam as a preacher. You really would prefer to totally avoid having to talk about it. Such is the case with today's lesson from the book of Luke. It is one of what scholars call the hard sayings of Jesus. The hard sayings of Jesus. Things that, at least on the surface, don't feel like the stuff we're used to hearing from Jesus and are very hard to comprehend, very hard to understand, even counterintuitive. This is one of those hard sayings of Jesus. Let's take a listen. Jesus is speaking. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say, it's going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Please pray with me. Might words spoken and words heard and the spaces in between help us to have your view of our world. Amen. It was a warm June day in 1858. The nation had been embroiled in controversy over the expansion of slavery into newly settled states in the West, and one compromise after another had been proposed and then accepted. Some territory would be open to slavery, other parts of the new land would not. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and most recently, the Nebraska-Kansas Act of 1854. A compromise measure which resulted, among other things, in violent struggles in Kansas between those who wanted slavery and those who did not. So violent that people began to speak of bloody Kansas. One of those who had been involved in many of the compromise solutions was the Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. 5 years later, on that June day in 1858, the Republican nominee for senator from Illinois, chosen to run against Douglas, was a one-term congressman from Springfield, Illinois. He rose to speak at the Illinois Republican State Convention. He was tall and thin, known for his wit, but also for his sometimes somber view of life. He was self-educated and well-versed, not only in the law, but also in Shakespeare and the Bible. And both were often alluded to in his speeches. No doubt as he stood up, he cleared his throat, his prominent Adam's apple sliding up and down his throat. And then he began. "Mr. President," he said, referring to the convention's presiding officer, "Mr. President and gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it." And then Abraham Lincoln launched into one of his most famous speeches, the so-called House Divided speech, referencing the divisions that were tearing at the very national fabric between those who wanted slavery to continue and those who did not. He noted how the Nebraska-Kansas Act had created even more agitation, even more division, even more violence. Under the operation of that policy, he said that agitation had not only not ceased, but has constantly grown. And then he spoke the words which recognized the reality that the final throes of the debate might indeed lead to a civil war, even as they already had in Kansas. "In my opinion," he said, "it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed." And then, quoting from Scripture, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." I believe, he said, this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. Abraham Lincoln did not actually create the Civil War, though as president he would later declare the war. He was simply recognizing the reality that presented itself in mid-19th century America. The nation was already divided, arguably had been divided since before the Revolutionary War. The nation was already rife with divisions that were even enshrined in the Constitution itself, where slavery was permitted. Such divisions would ultimately lead to a crisis, ultimately lead to violence. And that seemed more than obvious to the lawyer from Springfield, even if others were in a constant state of denial, believing that such divisions could endure. Our lesson from Luke is not the source for the house divided quote. It actually comes a bit earlier in the Gospel of Luke. But in our passage, Jesus is most certainly speaking of similar divisions and appears to even say that he is the cause of them. "Do you think that I have come to bring peace on earth?" he asks rhetorically. "No, I tell you, but rather division." And then he goes on to recite this heartbreaking list of familial divisions, some of which some of us may have personally experienced. Father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. How can this be? How can Jesus say these things? Is he not spoken of as being the Prince of Peace? He is, of course, not only spoken of as being the Prince of Peace, he is the Prince of Peace. And he does bring a certain kind of peace, but not a peace based on the social order of the day, nor for that matter, the social order of our day. When Jesus says that he brings divisions, he does not mean that he actually causes such divisions. They already exist. His presence, though, his truth, his preaching, his actions simply point up these things that are already present. As one scholar writes, Jesus' emphatic words of division need to be understood in relationship to the core realities of the first century. In that first century world, those core social realities included very, very unequal distributions of power and of wealth. Not only those most obvious, like in the relationships between masters and slaves, not only the most obvious, like those between those in high government positions and everyday peasants, but also within families themselves. Fathers dominated the household in that patriarchal world. Wives and mothers had few rights, few privileges, and could be divorced literally at the drop of a hat. Sons were considered vital, daughters, less so. And firstborn sons, they had a great advantage over all their siblings. And that's just one power imbalance. That's just the imbalance within families. Such inequities marked the entire first century social structure. So it is that Jesus observes that the justice, equality, and reconciliation that he calls for will indeed not only turn the world of class structures upside down, it will also turn families upside down. And those who have the power, the wealth, the status, he is saying, will resist those changes. The divisions, he's saying, they're already there, but they will become more pointed, more obvious when they are seen in light of the kind of world that I am proclaiming, says Jesus. Here's how one New Testament scholar sums it up. The peace that Jesus inaugurates and bestows involves the establishment of proper relationships of mercy, justice, and peace between God and humanity. Not everyone, however, wants or welcomes that divine peace plan. Hence, the initiation of Jesus' peace agenda also triggers contentious disunity and fissures among all facets of society, right down to the societal core of the household. This, of course, is exactly what happened in the Civil War. Brothers literally fought against brothers in many of the battles of that war. The crisis Lincoln predicted did indeed happen, and the house divided did begin to collapse, almost destroying the nation. And we still bear the scars of that divided house to this very day, no question. There were those who had much to lose if slavery was abolished. And so they resisted the call to take that peculiar institution, as it was called, and set it aside and work for a day of freedom and justice for all folks, regardless of race. Now, some or all of this sermon may seem rather academic and archaic, all about times long since past, analyzed by a scholar, by an historian, moi. But deep down, if we're honest, deep down we all know this is not just a matter of history, ancient or American. Deep down, we all know that this very moment is a time when our divisions as a nation are so obvious that they are seen literally around the world. Right here, right now. Indeed, I am not the first to suggest that, as in the days of Lincoln, our divisions could ultimately lead to a collapse of our national house. When I got to this point in writing this sermon, I got stuck. I wrote an ending that just didn't feel right. Wrote it on Wednesday and thought about it ever since. I spoke in the original ending about making sure we understood our own core values, that we be willing to stick with them while being willing to compromise on other aspects of life. Martin Luther spoke about those things that are essentia, essential, and things that are adiaphora, those things, ideas, ways of living that are optional, not essential to our core beliefs. We can compromise on the adiaphora, said Luther, but we must hold on to the essentia, the essentials. In that original ending, I even suggested using our church mission statement as a tool for determining what is essential. And that too is a good idea. It's printed in your bulletin every Sunday. If you want to go home and do that, I encourage you to do so. But still, it felt like I was missing the point of the text if that's all that I said. It felt as if I was missing what this so-called hard saying of Jesus was really all about. And I guess I was. Because what I was conveniently leaving out was that in saying all these things, Jesus got himself into so much trouble that he was crucified. When he spoke out against the established way of life, that way of life in the first century where power and wealth were inequitably distributed, when he said it was unfair, unjust, unloving, when he said that the inequitable distribution of power and wealth would eventually lead to the collapse of that society, those who were privileged strung him up and left him to die. So there's a real hopeful note for you. Hold on to your core values. Be willing to speak out and speak up when you see inequities in society. Champion the poor, the marginalized, the destitute. Yes, it may cost you your life, but that's what it may take. Just what you want to hear, isn't it? And just what I want to tell you right before leaving on a very privileged 6-week time of vacation and rest. No wonder I was back at my computer at 7 o'clock this morning. But let's not forget that Jesus' story doesn't end with crucifixion. It ends with resurrection. Yes, the powers of Rome seem to have the upper hand on Friday, but on Sunday, the way of healing, justice, love, and peace had the final word. And even the division between life and death was healed. Life and love won on that Sunday. Divisions exist in our nation and in our world. Serious divisions. Divisions that aren't going to go away tomorrow or a year from November, no matter what. And that's more than obvious. And frankly, it can be exhausting. Truly exhausting. I heard recently about someone who has decided they will not follow current events. No newspapers, no television newscasts, no internet news services. And I suppose that's one way to approach it. And maybe we all need to take a break once in a while. But I don't think it's realistic. I really don't. This is an interconnected world. And what happens in Washington, in Beijing, in Moscow, in London impacts what happens on Sanibel or wherever you're from. I think we need to acknowledge the divisions and then work for a world where there is indeed justice, healing, and joy. And we need to acknowledge that to do so may be costly in the short run. Might it mean more divisions along the way to that world where there is true and lasting peace? More than likely. But that should not deter us. For the promise offered up by Jesus is clear. The day will come, though it may not be in your lifetime or mine, when peace does reign on earth. True peace, lasting peace, God's peace. But in the meantime, you and I are called to work for justice, for peace, for healing, for love. You and I are called to live with the hard sayings as well as with the promises. You've got 6 weeks to think about it.